Hello everyone, and welcome back to Fluxfolio Finance. Today, we are stepping into one of the darkest paradoxes in modern finance and geopolitics. The world watches the Middle East with fear, seeing only missiles, instability, and the rising threat of a prolonged war with Iran. But behind the headlines, behind the images of destruction and uncertainty, there may be something far more calculated at work. Because to the casual observer, the United States appears to be bleeding money in another endless conflict, yet from another angle, the longer this war drags on, the more wealth America may actually be positioned to absorb. And that is the real question we are exploring today. Because after already harvesting enormous amounts of capital from Europe, the United States may now be turning its attention toward Asia. Nations like Japan, South Korea, and even parts of Europe are being pushed into a trap where they must either raise interest rates and crush their own asset markets, or let their currencies weaken and watch capital flee. Either way, their wealth begins to leak out of their own systems and flow back toward the United States. So let's begin with the foundation of this whole idea, because one of the biggest mistakes analysts make is assuming Iran can be understood through the same framework as Iraq or Libya. That is not the case. Many geopolitical observers still think that removing a leader is enough to collapse a regime. That logic may have worked elsewhere, but Iran functions on a very different level. The idea is simple. This is not a system built around one individual at the top. It is a structure sustained by deeply rooted religious conviction, spiritual loyalty, and a collective sense of historical mission. In a system like that, the death of a leader does not necessarily break the movement. It can actually strengthen it. And that is where the danger begins. Because if the leadership sees martyrdom not as defeat, but as legacy, then a prolonged conflict becomes not something to avoid, but something to embrace. Some of Iran's senior leaders are already in their 80s. For them, martyrdom could become a final act of political immortality, one that binds the next generation even tighter against the enemy. In that sense, America is not facing a conventional regime. It is facing a structure that can metabolize sacrifice and turn death into fuel. That is why this becomes a war of attrition, and on the surface it looks absurdly expensive for the United States. Iran can launch drones that cost only $20,000 each, while America responds with interceptor missiles that can cost $4 million apiece. The imbalance is staggering. It looks like pure financial self-destruction. But that appearance may be misleading, because from a business perspective, the loss may not be a real loss at all. This brings us to the second layer of the story, the way money actually moves inside the American system. Those billions of dollars spent on missiles and defense systems do not simply disappear into the air. They are not burned, they are transferred. Taxpayer money moves from the government's left hand into the right hand of domestic defense contractors and military-industrial firms. And those firms are not neutral players. They are deeply embedded in the political system. Many of them are major donors. Many of them help sustain the very machinery of power that authorizes the spending in the first place. So when Washington spends billions on war, it is not just paying for weapons, it is reinforcing domestic networks of capital and political influence. In effect, the state is funding its own allied class before an election cycle, while also preparing the conditions to harvest even larger sums from the rest of the world. And that is why the cost of war may be viewed not as a burden, but as an investment. To understand why this logic is so different today, we need to go back to the oil crisis of 1980. At that time, conflict between Iran and Iraq sent oil prices surging. The United States, heavily dependent on imported energy, was vulnerable. Inflation rose to 14%. Interest rates were forced up to 20%. The result was brutal. Gold, silver, and real estate all suffered through a long bear market, and America had no real control over the source of the shock. It was the buyer, not the controller. But the situation now is fundamentally different. The United States is no longer simply a vulnerable consumer of oil. It is now the world's largest oil exporter, producing 12.9 million barrels per day. In 1980, America was at the mercy of Middle Eastern supply. Today, it has far more control over its own energy position, and that changes everything, because now the United States can play a two-layer game. First, it can protect itself domestically. It can restrict exports when needed. It can release oil from its 400 million barrel strategic reserve. It can manage internal prices more effectively and insulate its own economy from the full force of a prolonged conflict, even one that lasts 200 days. Second, while shielding itself, it can exploit the rest of the world. As other nations scramble for energy, America can sell oil at elevated prices to desperate buyers, especially in Asia, and the spread has already widened dramatically. The gap between U.S. oil and Middle Eastern oil has jumped from roughly $5 or $6 per barrel to $18 per barrel. That is not a marginal shift. That is a massive premium, and someone has to pay it. This is where the larger mechanism of global wealth extraction comes into focus. The strategy works in two steps. Step one is exporting inflation. By allowing conflict to disrupt Middle Eastern trade routes and energy flows, the United States helps create a world in which Europe and Asia face soaring energy costs. Inflation rises abroad. Production costs increase. Households suffer. Central banks panic. And because the U.S. is now more insulated by its own energy position, it does not suffer in quite the same way as the import-dependent economies do. Then comes step two, the interest rate trap. Once inflation begins spreading through Europe and Asia, their central banks are forced into an impossible choice. If they keep interest rates low, their currencies weaken, confidence drops, and capital flees toward the United States. But if they raise interest rates to defend their currencies, they slow their own economies, damage credit markets, and drive down the price of their own stocks and real estate. Either way, wealth begins moving. If rates stay low, capital escapes. If rates rise, assets collapse. And in both scenarios, the destination of fleeing money is often the same: the United States. That is the essence of the harvest. American capital, backed by a strong dollar and a comparatively protected domestic system, can then move abroad and buy weakened foreign assets at distressed prices. Stocks, real estate, companies, infrastructure, all of it becomes cheaper when local currencies are weak and local economies are under pressure. This is one reason U.S. stock markets can remain strong or even rise during prolonged geopolitical conflict. They are not only being supported by domestic capital, they are being fed by frightened global capital searching for a place to hide. And that brings us to the final part of the story, which is where this becomes personal. Because beyond governments, central banks, and global capital flows, there is also the position of the individual investor. The script ends with the image of the hen and the egg, and it is a powerful one. Your first accumulated capital is the hen. Its purpose is not to be consumed. Its job is to lay eggs so that more hens can eventually be created. That is how wealth compounds. That is how financial independence begins. But many people destroy that process too early. They spend their first real savings on status, on liabilities, on things that feel like rewards but do not generate anything in return. They eat the hen before it has time to build the farm, and that is why so many remain trapped. Because in a world like this, where superpowers are not merely fighting wars but engineering capital flows, survival depends on understanding the cycle. You do not need to control the system, but you do need to recognize the game being played around you. And so the real question becomes brutally simple. As this global harvest unfolds, where are you sitting? Are you at the table as one of the diners, or are you on the menu? History suggests that those who stay rational while others panic are the ones who emerge with the greatest gains. That is how fortunes are built in moments of fear. That is how investors like Warren Buffett built enormous wealth. Not by panicking with the crowd, but by understanding what panic does to price, to capital, and to opportunity. So this is not just a story about Iran. It is not just a story about war. And it is not just a story about America. It is a story about how conflict, capital, and strategy can converge into one of the most ruthless forms of wealth transfer in the modern world. Thank you for watching Fluxfolio Finance. If you found this perspective valuable, make sure to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, stay sharp, stay skeptical, and stay ahead of the curve. Goodbye, and I will see you in the next video.